This video is about finance. It's just my personal perspective, not trying to sell anything, not financial advice, just how I view making money, saving money, and investing money. When I think about money in general, and what's the purpose? I think about the end in mind, which is wealth. Uh, and when I say wealth, I'm not thinking about material things. I'm thinking about using my money, leveraging my money to have more time in life, to support my family and friends, spend time with my family and friends, have health, have choice and intention and purpose, have security in things like owning my own home and things of that nature. Key concepts I think about when investing and saving my money, I think about psychology, I think about diversification, I think about statistical probabilities, and I think about borrowing. All right, starting off, earn money, right? I need to earn money in some way. It could be my own business, could be working for someone else. Whatever I do, I need to advance in my field, right? Get better at it. Maybe it's through education, through experience, but I need to advance so that people will pay me more money. I need to get smart at that job, right? So people that I work for can pay me more money. Or if I own a business, I get better at it, right? And so that I can make more money in my business. Also, when it comes to earning money, I think about side opportunities. So I think about what else can I do in addition to my uh, current job, right? Maybe I could shift to that entirely, right? If it becomes more interesting and lucrative, or just another option, right? In case my main source of income doesn't fall through. So, all right, now that I have the money, I need to spend it and I need to save it, right? And I think about the very basic but obvious fact that I shouldn't spend more than I make so that I don't go into debt and that I need to save the extra money, investing it in some way. But when it comes to saving, I think about, not only do I need to just make a plan, I need to test that plan. So I've tried different things. I've tried different apps, Excel, writing it down on a napkin, right? But what has proven to be the most effective to me was whatever thing I use, I need to test it. So if I'm going to say, all right, I should be able to save X amount in 2 to 3 months, then I test it out. Did I save X amount in 2 to 3 months? If not, I go back and I review my expenses and different things on whatever system that I'm using. And then I make my adjustments from there, whether it's like cutting back on some expense, or what have you. Now, connected to spending is how I spend. So I knew just in our system, particularly in the US, that I need to use credit, right? When it comes to spending, using a credit card, I knew I had to get a credit card, right? Because just how our system works is that you had to build your credit so that you could uh, be approved for things like a mortgage loan. So I knew I have to have credit. But again, the same concept applies that I shouldn't spend more than I make, right? Paying the statement balance. I know that this topic is obvious, but for some it's not. All right, so I knew I had to pay my statement balance, right? I'm never paying interest on my credit card. That would be idiotic. It can happen, right? Life happens, but I always try to say in a way, the credit cards defeats its purpose, right? And its main purpose is just building you credit, maybe getting some cash back. Um, but if I was going to be paying interest on it, that'd defeat the whole purpose of the credit card because the interest rates are very high in most cases. Um, I was able to get a regular credit card starting out, but if I needed to, I would have done whatever it took. I would have got a starter credit card. That's a cash secured credit card. That entry level credit card, I would have gotten it, and then got a regular cash back credit card. Nowadays, you can get like 2%, and that's a pretty good standard. Is at least getting like just a regular, and that's what I'm focused on now. But getting a regular 2% plus cash back credit card, not worrying about points and other things, right? Keeping your life simple, just getting that cashback credit card. So I'm spending with the credit card and I'm saving money, right? Now, how am I divvying up that saving, that cash, that extra cash beyond I paid off all my expenses, right? I'm paying my credit card on time. How do I divvy up that cash, that savings, right? Where is it going? Right? It's going to three different things. It's going to a regular taxable non retirement investment account. It's going to my bank and it's going into retirement investing, right? It's split up among these three. All right, here's what I think about when it comes to what bank to pick. I made sure that that bank was publicly traded, and I made sure that they owned their own bank and they weren't a company that had a third party relationship with a bank when holding my cash. All right. And in those two ways, it offers additional regulatory oversight, ensuring the security of my money, or increasing the likelihood that my money will be secured. Also, that the money with the bank is FDIC insured and that the bank has a good reputation. But that's not the only thing um, that that I was considering when picking a bank. Right, I wanted to make sure that it was country based, so U.S. based in this case. That it had a good user interface, because that's just so important. What you want to be able to interact with it and clearly understand what you're doing when you're interacting with your bank. Typically now these days through an app, right? Just save time. But I also wanted to make sure that it offered a high yield savings account. And a lot of major banks these days don't. And so they're making money on your cash sitting in your savings account, offering essentially zero yield. And that's basically every major bank. And they're making money off of that. So I wanted to make sure that I'm making money off of my cash, that they're also still making money off of it, but that they're sharing the interest with me, right? And I'll get into what specific bank I use, but not that you have to use it, or not that, I'd say, oh, go use this or that one. But if the bank meets a lot of these wickets, or all of these wickets, right, then it could be a good consideration for somebody. All right. So some of my money is going into the bank, and we'll talk about allocation later, like how much goes into each bucket, right? Or what do I, how do I do it, right? But some of the money is going into my savings account on my bank that's growing because it's a high yield savings account, right? And it's also liquid. It's not trapped in that high yield savings account. I can pull it out, move it around without any fees or anything like that. Another bucket that my money is going into is my investment non-retirement account, right? And again, I want similar or the same things. I wanted to make sure that the company that I used was publicly traded, a publicly traded broker or company, US based or country based. I also wanted to make sure that it had a retirement account option within that brokerage, that it has good UI, um, and that it has offerings to just all the standard uh, stock investments, exchange traded funds, and different things like that. And I'll break those down. Um, and that it has a low borrowing rate, margin rate, and that's more in the advanced topic, but I'll break that down later too, right? And we'll get into how to set that up. But this is one of the buckets that I'm thinking about or thought about uh, where to allocate my money. Another one is my investment retirement account. Um, for mine in particular, my company offers matching, and so I chose to allocate some of my savings into them. Right? If I didn't have a company that offered matching, I would likely just put it into my brokerage that offered a retirement that had a retirement account. Right? Just because I personally like consolidation, I don't like having too many banks, too many retirement accounts. But I kept, I keep putting money into my company's retirement account at the time of making this video because they matched. But the point is that we have some allocation between putting your savings into your bank, into a high yield savings account, into a regular taxable brokerage account, and into some kind of retirement account, either through your work or directly through that same app, same brokerage. All right, now here are the more medium to advanced topics that I consider. Okay. And this is where we get into some of the concepts above, which is like psychology, diversification, statistical probability, and then later we'll get into borrowing. Where I had messed up in the past through my own investing and through my recommendations to some of my friends was having them, one, go all in on the stock market, and two, concentrating into individual stocks versus the broader market, right? And this is that psychological aspect of it, and like some statistical probability of it, and the diversification aspect of it, right? So one with the psychology, one would say, "Oh, why would I ever just hold cash?" Right? Say you're yielding on your cash in your savings account, you're getting 2, 3, 4%, right? When the S&P 500 averages like 7 to 10% a year annually, why not put it all in the broader market, right, to grow and have very little in cash? And I found for myself and for my friends, when the market goes down hard, or they we are in some kind of emergency situation, it's so easy to just sell your assets and either take a loss or take a profit, and then you have to pay taxes on that, and you also miss out on future gains. So having that cash reserve there and building up as high as you can protects you psychologically from freaking out and selling your investments. You're not getting yourself uh, psychologically fearful from holding your money in the stock market. Because I found with a lot of people is once the market has a big downturn or they have to liquidate their assets, they kind of stop investing at that point, or takes them a really long time to get back into it. That's why having that cash, building up that cash reserves, will make you feel a lot more comfortable with not dissolving your investment in your regular taxable account, but particularly in your retirement account, where there are even more penalties if you're pulling it out um, before the retirement age. So when starting, what I think about doing and what I've been working on, right? I personally did it backwards, but what I'm trying to do now is build more cash reserves. So say you had $100 to do every month, right? Or $1,000, whatever your threshold is, right? But let's just use $100 because it's an easy number, right? 70 $70, right, or 70% is going to go into your savings, and it's going to build that up and up and up, hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars to tens of thousands of dollars, whatever you're comfortable with. Say it's 5 grand, 10 grand, 20 grand. You're going to build a reserve in your high yield savings account. At least you're making interest on it, and you're going to allocate 70% of your savings into that savings account until you reach that number that you're comfortable with, that you can draw on for emergencies, right? And then 30, maybe 10% will go towards your retirement account, and 20% will go towards your taxable account, right? And that's your allocation. And then once you get into that bigger reserve for your cash savings, earning yield, then you'll flip it. Maybe you'll start putting 70% in here and 30% in your uh, investing, your retirement account, right? 70% in your taxable account, 30% in your retirement account. And then if you have an emergency and you have to draw upon your banking savings, then you'll flip that again, right? You'll go back to putting 70% into here and the rest into your taxable and your retirement until you can draw back up. Never, when it comes to a match-based retirement account, never stop contributing as long as they're matching. So at least add enough money into your workplace retirement account if they're matching uh, up to the whatever they match to. So if it requires a certain minimum to reach your the maximum maxing that they provide, always stick with that, right? So never go below that. You could always minimize. Uh, you can always reduce your what you're putting into your regular investment taxable account brokerage. All that being said, I personally have always leaned towards I get my minimum matching, right? Or I get the full matching here for my retirement account work because I just happen to have a workplace one, right? Um, but I still focus and think that a lot more of my money, once I have my cash reserves built up, but a lot more of my money should go into my taxable brokerage, right? Because in my retirement account, either through this or this, right? In my retirement account, that money's trapped there. Yes, it's growing for the long term, but I can't access it without tax penalties until retirement age. So I can't use it on things like a house and emergency expenses, right? Even if my cash got so withdrawn, right? And if I didn't have these things built up, it would suck to pay the tax penalties on having to withdraw that down. So I really focus on once I get my cash reserves up, I would, like I mentioned before, I would do whatever I have in the way of extra savings. I would go like 70-30 or even like 90-10. That's my personal opinion. That's what I do. Now moving on to you're putting your money in your bank, right? Going to the savings account and then you're investing it. And I'm thinking about, but what do I put it in, right? And as I mentioned before, I messed up in the past for recommending my friends and for myself in the concentration. I concentrated in individual stocks versus putting a lot less into ETFs. ETFs are exchange traded funds. Basically, for the most part, they are a bunch of stocks, right? And I'm just going to be putting it simply. It's a bunch of stocks all held together in a single package, and you buy a portion of all those stocks together. The big one, the very general one, and the best one, in my opinion, is the S&P 500. It's in general the top 500 companies in the United States, and there's groups of people um, that kind of manage that, and basically they ensure that the best companies with, you know, high market cap, right? Like the company's worth a decent amount of money, right? And they're profitable so for, you know, X amount of quarters. There's different rules that they have, right? They made some like basic principled rules, and they try to keep the overall portfolio of the S&P 500 diverse with like different sectors in healthcare and uh, finance and military and agricultural different things, right? Um, and all those companies kind of meet these rules, and they invite all the good companies in, and then if a company starts doing poorly, they kick it out. And so that's the S&P 500, and there are exchange traded funds that mirror that. They mirror these 500 companies. And sometimes ETFs, exchange traded funds, there's people managing them, right? And they will charge some money for that. But for ETFs based on like the S&P 500, the management fee is really cheap because the rules and the structures are fairly simple. So the managers don't have to do a lot of work. So the management fee is low. And the S&P 500 in general grows, there's different numbers on this, but like let's say 7 to 10% a year in general, like conservatively. Okay. And that's a good rate of return historically. Like if you back test it, it's statistically shown to grow that much each year. And not just that, not just like the historical um, outcomes that, could indicate future returns, right? But as I alluded to, or as I explained, the system itself makes sense. It's like common sense, right? The way they have it structured. So it's a generally good um, ETF to get into, right? And it's diverse, right? Meaning that diversification. So it meets kind of some of these key concepts that I think about. It's being like statistically likely and diverse. Um, there are different ETFs, and they're represented by, let's say, letters or symbols, right? Different companies, different organizations offer these ETFs, right? Like the one that follows or tracks the S&P 500. So one of the cheaper ones, not expensive, right, but high quality, is, for example, VOO. It's a Vanguard based one, right? And that's just an example. That's one I personally use. It's an ETF, an exchange traded fund that mirrors or matches the S&P 500. There are others. There are international based ETFs that are more following the international companies and stock markets, like VXUS. And there are other ones that follow like minerals and energy and stuff like that. So there's GLD, which tracks the price of gold, and XLE, which tracks energy, and there are many, many more, right? But VOO is a basic one that averages 7 to 10% a year. And when I think about which ETF to use, um, I want to think about, just like my brokerage or bank or different things, I want to make sure that they're held by a reputable company. Um, I also want to make sure that they're diverse, right? It's not an ETF that has just like 10 companies in it, right? And that their allocation within the ETF is more or less decent, right? Or decently diversified. I know VOO and S&P 500 ETFs can be kind of weighted toward and carried by the big tech firms, but uh, for the most part, they're pretty good. Um, I also want to make sure that there's high AUM, uh, assets under management. Basically, that a lot of people are piled into these ETFs. When the volume is high and there's a lot of assets under management within these ETFs, like the VOO is one of the top ones, right? There's a lot of people buying and selling it. And so that when you're buying into it or selling it, you can get a generally more favorable price, because the price spread, if there's a lot of people buying and a lot of people selling all at the same time, the price spread could be a lot of smaller. These numbers this isn't a super important topic, right? Um, you're probably putting, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So like the price spread is not going to have much of an effect on you, but it's still important to just basically be in a big ETF, right? And I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to do that for my non-retirement taxable brokerage account. I'm going to get into big ETFs, right? Things that track the S&P 500, like the VOO. That's what I do. And then I'm going to do the same thing with whatever is basically like the S&P 500 for my work-based one. They might not have VOO, but I just look for something that's similar, that follows that. I look at what they offer, right? I'm not getting into their bonds or other low return investment vehicles. I'm just going straight for, especially when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s until you get closer to your retirement age. Um, I just think about, I'm just going to go for that 7 to 10% annualized return in my retirement account. I want those types of investment vehicles. And I wrote again here, high AUM ETFs, right? And same thing here. Now, that's the diversification piece. That's the statistical piece. The psychological piece, coming back to that psychology again. Okay. Just like we probably have direct deposit into our bank. It's happening all the time, right? It's a reoccurring thing. When you talk about, when it comes to psychology, everything you do needs to be automatic and reoccurring. So your direct deposits, obviously, you're going to set that up because you want your check, from whoever you work for, right? If you're working for someone, you want it to go into your bank account every day, and you expect that, and it's reoccurring. And you just have to pay your bills and such things, and your credit card, right? Same with your workplace. If you do a workplace one, you probably have it automatic, right? And that's where people grow most of their wealth, because it's, besides their house, right? And that's also automatic. Like you have to pay your mortgage every month, right? And you're growing, probably principal or equity in your home, right? But your 401k will grow a lot, because usually it's in a basic broad ETF, and you're just putting money into it, periodically, and you're not, and it's reoccurring. You're not thinking about it, right? That's usually set in stone, like with your employer. You have to do the same thing with your non-retirement investment account. You can't just be like, oh, I'm gonna hold some cash here, and then every once in a while, yeah, let me just add some more. Let me add some more, because you won't. Psychologically, you're gonna forget about it. You're gonna be like, well, I'd rather have, and this is talking about like after you build up your cash reserve, but even while you're building it, right? You have to allocate, even if it's a tiny amount. You have to allocate something. You have to turn it on, and then once you get your cash reserves up, then you can increase the amount, right? But you need something that you don't have to ever think about. It's just happening in the background, just like your Netflix or other subscription services, gym memberships, right? You just get charged, right? And the money's gone, and you don't even think about it. This has to be the case. This is what I think about. Like, this is what helped me stay consistent, right? This has to be the case when you're thinking about your taxable regular brokerage account. Um, Reoccurring, right? This at the bottom. Everything has to be automatic and reoccurring. Now we're gonna jump into an example, or my example, right? And it's gonna consolidate all of these topics, and hopefully this will help it make more sense, right? So I have my job and I have my side jobs, right? And also have my credit, right? Um, and I'm spending and I'm saving and I'm using my credit to spend. Um, and then I'm investing some allocation, right? Right now, I had mentioned I'm trying to save more cash to build that back up. And then I'm also investing some allocation of my money. Okay. And then before I mention the specific companies that I use, this is just what works for me, right? And there are other really great companies out there. And I would say, even if you wanted, even if I wanted to play it more safe, even though I don't like some of the bigger banks, there are some that offer decent user interface apps. And some people like to go in person for their banking, right? Um, and some of them have okay investment apps, brokerages, right, tied with the bank, right? But I personally use, for my investment and banking, right? I have my job to start. I use my job's matching, right? I contribute to that, and that's where I get my income. But I use Robinhood and SoFi. And one caveat or disclosure, right? And before I had mentioned um, that I should have done in the past. I would have a lot more money now if I focused on VOO, right, or some broad S&P 500 instead of individual stocks. I've put my hopes in various different companies, individual companies in the past, and I think some allocation of that is good. But primarily my allocation needed to be the S&P 500 and some other broad ETFs, right, into energy, into gold, into things like that. I would have a lot more money if I go and back test it, right, myself. I would have a lot more money now if I put into ETFs. I think it's okay to have some concentration into individual stocks, but primarily it needs to be in ETFs. So, all that being said, I put a ton of money into some individual companies, which include SoFi and Robinhood, uh, just for my own personal interests and beliefs. And some of it is to spite some. This is my own personal psychology, I guess. Some of it is to spite some of the bigger banks because I've had relationships with, I used bigger banks in the past, right? In college, and I got out of college, and I was charged some fees, right, for not having and not being a student and not having an income, even though I was trying to join the military and different things, and I got charged some fees. So I took all my money out of the big banks, and I did actually put it in another big bank that didn't charge fees, but ultimately I left that big bank as well, that other big bank, because they didn't offer any uh, high yield savings account. So I do have some misgivings, some disdain for bigger banks because they charge people fees when a lot of times if they don't have an income in their into their bank, right? And they also make money off of your money sitting in there and they don't give you a cut, right? Whereas Robinhood and SoFi are more digital, right? And SoFi is the one. Robinhood third parties its banks. I don't bank with them, but SoFi owns its own bank, and they don't have physical locations, right? They meet all the wickets for me. They're publicly traded. They're U.S. based. They offer high yield savings accounts because they don't. One factor is that they're trying to get customers, right? But they also they don't have physical banks, which some people like. But those physical banks and having tellers and all this stuff costs a lot of money, right? And so the big banks eat up that expense, and whereas SoFi doesn't. And I think that's part of the reason why they can offer high yield savings accounts that are truly liquid, that you can move the money around, right? Not just like um, a CD or something else where your money's locked up. They offer like a true savings account where your money is truly liquid. So that's why I chose Robinhood and SoFi. I do my investments on Robinhood and have some investments on SoFi, but I do my banking on SoFi. And I do want to also add another caveat is that, you know, SoFi is a little bit more of a standard, not eccentric player like Robinhood. And I do despise some of the things that Robinhood offers in the forms of like betting and different um, betting markets, right? It's like a double edged sword. It's just like the credit card. Um, you can get a cash back, you can build your credit. That's good on a credit card, but they're also banking on people overspending, right? And having to pay a lot of debt, a lot of high interest, and that's how they make their money. I think similarly for Robinhood, great user interface, but and so many other amazing benefits that I believe they're personally amazing to me and are effective for me. But it's a double edged sword because I know they're trying to entrap some people into their gambling side of their company, right? and extract people's wealth that way. So just keep that in mind. But for Robinhood, I have reoccurring investment turned on, right? That's psychology, right? And then diversification, I'm reoccurring into VOO just steadily every day, every week, right? I also have it further diversified, right? I have gold, right, in case the S&P 500, the US stock market goes down, and then I have it international, right, in case those do well. So you can slice it and dice it different ways, but you could just, I think I could just do the VOO and be totally good. Um, but I think it's also nice to have like some international, some gold. That's what works for me. Um, so I'm doing that with Robinhood. I'm allocating money. I'm building cash into my high yield savings account in SoFi, right? And then all of that is helping me with to my end state of my wealth, right? I have more time. I have more leverage. I was able to buy my own home, right? And some of that was with my job security as well, right? But I had a lot, having more money and having more assets build up gives you a lot more leverage and maneuverability with whatever you want to get into and do, right? And I'm gonna keep doing these things, right, until I um, build up more and more assets and I become more and more valuable, right? All right, for this next part, I want to be mindful and I want to reiterate that this is something that I personally do. It's not financial advice. I don't recommend it, especially for anybody that is not good with their credit cards, like they're paying interest all the time on their credit cards or they're in other debt traps, right? There are probably other more streamlined personal loans that are more appropriate, that you could talk, that this anybody could talk with like a financial advisor about doing if they needed to rein in their debt, right, on their credit cards or anything, right? So I would say this particular topic is way more advanced, and it's only for I'd only consider it for myself in the fact that I don't have any debt really per se, uh, mainly besides like my house mortgage, right? And I never pay credit card debt, right? So I'm more secured um, to be able to do this strategy, and I'll break it down here, stemming from this example. Okay, this will help it make sense when I talk about this borrowing strategy that I implement, and it's strategic and it's only in the emergency sense. Okay, so say I have 50K, $50,000 in assets in something like the VOO, right? It's primarily in that. Maybe some of it's in gold and different things like that. And then I have $10,000 saved in a high yield savings account on SoFi. This is just made up. It's just examples, right? Say my income's $5,000 a month, and I have expenses of $3,000 a month, just for example, right? So I'm netting $2,000 a month. I'm putting that into my investments and savings or whatever. I get some emergency bill, right, for $15,000, $5,000 over my savings account. I don't want to liquidate my um, hood my Robinhood investments, right? I don't want to sell it. Um, Maybe I have to pay this debt, this sudden expense, this $15,000 in cash, or floating it on a credit card would cause me to pay high interest on my credit card, right? So I need to pay off the credit card right away, which requires cash, right? So what Robinhood offers, since they're competing for customers constantly, they offer relatively as low as they can, a low margin rate, right? There's some others that are more competitive than Robinhood even, but generally they offer one of the lowest margin borrowing rates, right? Again, this is an advanced strategy. So Robinhood offers, so you're borrowing against your investment holdings, right? Um, they offer a low borrowing rate, so you could effectively take out cash, and now you're in debt to Robinhood, right? But they align their rates with like whatever the Federal Reserve interest rates and other market conditions, right? They try to keep it low as possible. And if Federal Reserve rate, depending, SoFi, conversely, and same with Robinhood, they offer high yielding savings rate, right? So these things kind of work in tandem. But say I borrow the $5,000, that's 10% of my against my Robinhood assets, right? That's in VOO, let's say. I borrow only 10%. For me, I never, I keep my margin borrowing rate extremely low. It's in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Max would ever be 10%. And if you're in an asset that there's always risk to this. But if you're in some assets like the S&P 500 and um, in the risk here is that your assets go down. If your assets go too far down, Robinhood will ask for their money back, right? Um, and if your assets go too far down, then you'll have to sell some of your assets to pay that money back. And then all the terrible things happen, right? And this is how people have lost a lot of money, right? Because they borrow like half their portfolio and then they use that money to invest in more stocks, right? And they do all these crazy things, right? And people lose everything, right? Because they're like betting on individual stocks and then they just completely go under and they lose it all. But in this case, like the S&P 500 would have to go down 90%, right? I feel like the whole US economy would collapse, everything would go down. So you have to bet like how likely would that be to happen, right? For them to ever margin call you, right? So you're borrowing at low rates in this case, or low percentage. In this case, we're borrowing 5%, or sorry, 10%, which is $5,000 against this. Now we're able to pay this $15,000 debt, and then we didn't have to sell. I didn't have to sell any assets, right? So I didn't have to pay the tax on that, which the the tax the tax you'd have to pay on your profits for your S&P 500 VOO holdings, plus the missed future gains, right, would very likely be a lot more than paying off the margin loan, right? Especially in low interest rate environments, right? And this is where it's more effective is in generally lower interest rate environment. Margin loans aren't as effective in higher interest rate environments, but it's a way to leverage and use our assets and not sell our assets to pay off debt, right? Because I don't want to pay, you know, high pay tax on this. I don't want to have to use a credit card and pay interest on my credit card, right? I need to pay off this. So once I pay it, once I borrow the $5,000, right? And then it'll take me in this example 2 to 3 months, 2.5 months, right, to pay back that margin loan. And then I start filling back my cash reserves, get it back to that 10,000. Maybe now I increase it to something higher. So that's how we use marginal loans, right? So say like the margin rate is 5% annually. Um, in a low interest rate environment where margin rates are low, that's a lot more effective sometimes than for me, than obviously paying a 10%, 20%, 30% credit card debt, or taking out a personal loan, which could be like 8%, 10%, right? And then I have to take like um, uh, a lot of times I think there's like a line of credit, right? So then it hits my credit report versus like I can just borrow a little bit of money against my assets, right? Um, and again, I'm just borrowing a small amount to cover some emergency expense, and I'm only using it in emergency expense. I'm trying not to use it to invest in anything, right? It's just in the back in case I need it, right? Well, so I can keep building and not selling my assets, right? But that's why we got to get our cash reserves high, right? So we don't even want to do that. And please, you don't need to do this. You just need to, if you're concerned about a huge debt, some expense, just build your cash reserves even higher, higher and higher and higher, and focus on that. And just put small, build this to, next time I'm going to build this back to 20K so I don't have to borrow again. Okay. Um, and that's later on, right? So that's for me, that'll be like the margin phase, right? Until I can get to like one, two, three, $5 million will probably be the number. We'll see with inflation and everything in the future, right? Um, but once you get into the multi-million-dollar stage, you unlock being able to borrow against your assets at a much cheaper rate, even than low interest rate environments. Well, particularly in low interest rate environments still, but even lower than margin, right? You get into S block, which is securities backed lines of credit, right? And once you have, so you had $5 million, uh, you can borrow, you can have all your money in the S&P 500 and in VOO. So you have $500 million in that and gold and different things, right? You could borrow and live off of 100 grand a year through an S block vehicle, um, not pay, and this is like what the rich do essentially, not pay taxes on that because you're borrowing your money instead of going towards taxes, right? Selling your assets and paying taxes on that, your money is paying the person giving you the loan, right? But these interest rates can be in like the 2 and 3%. And if you're annualizing 7 and 10% a year, right, and you use an S block to borrow, you are kind of paying those fees with the growth of your portfolio, and you're not having to sell your portfolio, you're not having to sell your assets, um, and you're just borrowing against your assets, so you're not paying the taxes on having to sell your assets, um, and then you are also not missing out on any future gains, right? That 7 to 10% year growth. um, it'll just extend your timeline and the amount of money you need. You'll need less of it relatively because you won't be selling your assets, right? And or passing your money down to future generations. You'll be able to preserve more of your assets, and pass it down, um, through using later on higher net worth strategic borrowing things like S block. All right, and that's borrowing, and we'll take a break there. So we've done all these things, and we're building up our wealth, right? And our wealth and our assets. Um, how do I? And these connect to each other. These help preserve wealth, and they do different things. But I'm going to talk about survival and longevity of ourselves, of our family, of our wealth, right? This is what I want to personally do, right? The house is one thing, right? And I've done the house, right? Just owning versus renting, right? There are trade-offs, and depending on your location, depending on different factors, for the most part, it's better to own, right? But there could be some stages in your life, right, where as long as you're investing, but like renting temporarily, may make sense because there's other expenses, right, with a home, in taxes and blah blah blah. Uh, but generally, it's like a security thing, when it comes to owning your own house, right? No one for the most part, you're paying your bills. Like you your landlord can't suddenly say, hey, get out, right? And there are renter protections, but in general, you have a lot more security. Um, but I also think about holding other assets, right? I used to think about gold was kind of like, well, with the point, if everything falls apart, like your gold's not going to be worth anything anyways, right? But um, what if like your country's currency falls apart, right? It totally collapses, right? Um, and another country's currency like remains, right? If they all collapse, I guess it's all, you know, there's going to be other things to worry about. But like if one currency collapses, right, for different reasons, right, mismanagement, overprinting, right, having that physical gold, right, if you need to move or go somewhere or enter into a new like economic system, new fiat currency system, you will have physical gold to be able to maneuver in that way. And similar to Bitcoin, right? And um, now these assets could physically be taken away from you potentially, right? But um, in the case where it's not, and you need to adjust to some new system, um, having not everything be based in your fiat currency could be a means of survival. That's how I view it, anyways. And then, of course, the house. Um, I also think about, uh, say, you're not having to travel, right? And food prices constantly go up. There's always going to be inflation, and inflation is going to impact all these things, right? That's why owning your home, you need to own your home because like it's just going to keep going up in value, and you're going to be priced out, right? Of buying a house. So like these things just keep going up and up. Same with food, right? It's just going to generally it's going to keep getting more expensive. So the more, particularly in the U.S., you know, I have my gripes with like just endless urban sprawl. Like I do like density, and if you are in a more dense place, there's community gardening and things like that that I think are super important. And you can do whatever gardening you can wherever you are. Do whatever gardening you can, but we do have some leverage and opportunities. If you have a house and you have land, right? In the U.S., we have more land, so and I'm a big proponent of like having some grass and playing on the grass if you have kids and dogs, right? But no, it doesn't need to be all grass, right? And you can turn a lot of your property into farming, and however much work you want to put into it. You could do things that kind of produce on their own and are low maintenance, or things that take more maintenance if you enjoy it. But I think growing produce, growing things that you can eat, and like having livestock and different things where you can on your own property, um, is a means of survival and longevity. I also think about with like the advances of solar panels and batteries. This isn't like a wealth thing. This is a survival thing, and this isn't an investment strategy because, at least the numbers right now, like I have solar, but it takes so long for you ever to see your like a return on your solar. But I think just as like a situational survival thing, right? If different, depending on how your home is gets its energy, right? But like, you know, there's oil burning and coal burning and natural gas and nuclear power plant, different things, right? But you're getting it from a company, right, that can increase the price of the energy they provide you, right? You think right now, like with data centers and different things, right? So I think long term, having highly efficient solar panels and batteries, you need them both, um, to generate your own power so that you could use it for heating, cooling, run the systems, right? Electrically run the systems that do different things. Your house also would need to be like configured in this way. Cooking and different things, right? That uh, you have enough panels and they're efficient enough that you can basically live off your own house without needing someone else to provide you energy. We can do that in this modern day and age, more or less. So I think that's also a really good long-term strategy. Obviously, that costs a lot of money, right? Which you'll build up by doing all these things. Um, storages of food and water and different things. And some of these are good too, just for like emergency situations, depending on where you live, like hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and different things, right? Um, Having your own control can help you um, and your community, right? One thing I didn't mention here is like community, super important, right? Like the community garden and being close to like your neighborhood, friends and family, right? Because that's who's gonna take care of each other, right? In your other friends and having close connections with your family, friends and family, right? Your networks, right? Like locally or whether they're farther or closer, but those are also going to be means of survival and longevity um, for you and for them, right? If you're helping them, especially if you have like solar and can help out your community that way, right? If like say the power goes out. So yeah, food and water storage, right? Like just additional for crisis, right? Um, um, and then weapons in general, right? Just general like security for different situations, right? Um, and I also think about knowledge, right, as a means of survival and longevity, passing down information like this in both digital form and both print form, right? And that could be books, right, for survival, how to do things, right? And there's also more self-contained systems that like tell you how to like rebuild society and blah blah blah. I think those things are really cool too, so having these different ways of preserving knowledge can, especially for like your if you have kids and just different people down the line, right? Having that in that way can protect you for different scenarios, and then passing skills and info to different people, right? Digital form and print form, super important. It's like teaching your kids or your friends and family or your community members like different things for like farming, repairing something, blah blah blah. I think that's also a means of survival and longevity. And that's everything. So I don't know. I just wanted to make this video. This is all from my perspective, how I'm doing things, right? And I hope it's interesting. Okay, thanks for watching.